History between the two world wars, 1918 to 1939. The 20th century context. When in 1914 soldiers marched among masses of jubilant onlookers on their way to the battles of the First World War, many of them were aware that they might die, but not that a whole way of life would be buried with them. The marchers led the world into decades of monumental changes in how life was led and thought about. Many of the developments already underway in Western culture since the late 19th century were vastly energized and accelerated after 1918, advances in the sciences and technology making the masses benefactors of the production of goods and means of communication, the political, social, and economic emancipation of so far neglected groups, and the progress of globalization. Prior to 1914, many people had viewed these developments, visible in their early impact, as validation of an optimistic, strongly progressive assessment of the future. Expectations had been high for an unbroken amelioration of the human condition. But even in the 20th century, it showed the ambivalence of these seemingly beneficial processes. First, science and technology's increasing understanding of and control over natural forces led to substantial improvements in human life, but also would provide the tools for new types of warfare, genocides, and weapons of mass destruction. Second, the masses did become the benefactors when the ideal of equality was approximated to a higher degree in the situation of women, minorities, and the like, and other marginalized groups. But this humanitarian development was counterbalanced by the misuse of mass movements for experiments in building new societies that ruthlessly enforced limited visions on what the human being should or could be. The results were dictatorships of previously unthinkable brutality. In liberal democratic societies, however, the excesses of mass consumption, mass media, and mass production made their own far less destructive but still negative impact on human life and nature. Third, until the year 1945, globalization increased, but it was still marked by the presence of vast colonial empires. Nevertheless, what used to be a Western-centered world gradually developed into a truly global world of states. The mobilization of many parts of the globe for World War I was still in accord with the existing colonial world order, although its long-time implications would be contrary to it. Signs of things to come would be seen in that of the nation-state. In retrospect, however, clearly visible. Beginning in anthropology, the study of cultures developed as an alternative to the state-centered approach to history. The anthropological approach to cultures could be linked to the preferences for context and uniqueness in historicism. On their parts, Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee revived the model of cultural cycles, rise, peak, and decadence. In their approaches to world history, the revived cyclical model would become a keen competitor for the progressive view in the 20th century. But only after the year 1945 did globalization become a major feature in Western thought, and specifically in historiography. Challenges to historians. The increasing disenchantment with the aspects of the modern world also shaped historiographical developments. The impact was not uniform, but varied according to specific national and cultural contexts. To this transformational process, historiography contributed its own developmental trends that became intertwined with those of life in ways far beyond simple dependency. In the aftermath of enormous shocks emanating from the great human drama played out in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, historians faced now especially difficult challenges of how to connect the past with a sharply different present and with the new expectations for future in the construction of the historical nexus. In many Western nations, suddenly and extraordinarily changes called into question the sense of, but not the need for, continuity. There, historians found it hard to discern the intertwining of continuity and change that were normal for human life in a context where change seemed to be absolutely triumphant. By the year 1918, history found itself firmly established as a discipline in the Western system of knowledge. Historians were aware of the need for adequate and complex rules that guided and governed their inquiries or their methodology, as well as for a set of basic views on the dynamics and structure of both the world and the human condition. As they have at all times, most historians in the early 20th century worked within the confines of mainstream historiography, and that has never been shaped by just one great or grand dominant theory neatly followed by another, but rather by a composite of elements from old and new approaches and methodologies. The remainders of past historical thought and practice had themselves once been innovative approaches to the understanding and explanation of the past human condition. After their possibilities had been explored and their excessive claims to sole validity had faded, the elements of them had been augmented and modified. As the new theories were suggested, the process of adjustment repeated itself. Therefore, history's theoretical base has never been organized systematically, but craft-like by accumulating insights at the cost of theoretical purity. Historical thought and practice acquired a high degree of adaptability. But from the 1880s, historians agreed that historical methodology should be scientific, and although disagreements developed over the exact meaning of this term, that demand met with a mainstream historiography guided by widely shared methodological elements, sometimes reaching all the way back to the ancient times. That of critical use of sources to establish facts, proper restraint in the construction of the count of the past, and the obligation of historians to strive for objectivity. Reshaping these elements became the primary task of historicism. As the century progressed, the divergence widened on what was meant by the phrase scientific approach. On one side stood the perspective known as Historicism. This rose to prominence in conjunction with the German Geschichtswissenschaft, or historical science. The word Wissenschaft differed in its connotations from that of the English word science, with its close association with the natural sciences. Wissenschaft referred to an inquiry after truth that was conducted according to strict and agreed-upon rules, and in the proper inquisitive spirit of objectivity. Historicism's earliest important representatives, Johann Gottfried von Herder and Leopold von Ranke, were followed in the 1880s by Wilhelm Dilthey and the Neo-Rankians. Historicist tenets strongly influenced historiography well into the 20th century. At historicism's core stored the affirmation of an obtainable, authoritative truth about the past. Access to that was afforded by the critical study of sources conducted in optimal detachment from the context of the present objectivity, and that held true despite the insight that historians themselves were seen as being immersed in the flux of life. And indeed, with this very immersion, historians had the ability to understand, verstehen, the human way of coping with a world in which each phenomenon was unique and not just a variation of something general. And empathetic understanding arguably yielded to this a sufficiently approximate reconstruction of the past. Historians therefore no longer needed to apply the generalizing methods of the natural sciences, but could instead rely on empathetic understanding of the specific contexts of life, each unique in and of itself. Such a perspective was well suited to seeing the individual as the important historical agent. All phenomena of past life had to be grasped in terms of entities, such as persons, cultures, nations, etc., and as results of their actions or events. Some historians even stress the organic becoming of all entities, but in any case, all phenomena, be they individuals, events, nations, or cultures, existed in a web of meanings, Zusammenhang, the unfolding of which, however, had no universal aim or telos. The world was not the necessary result shaped by abstract interconnections. No, each context carried its own unique meaning. Hence, the writing of history must not aim at reporting cause and effect sequences, but it must produce narratives. Truth in history inhered in individual contexts. Therefore, historicists rejected the use of standards derived from other contexts. They especially objected to those large-scale teleological meanings that marked the progress views of Marx and Hegel. Of course, these patterns negated the truths to be learned from unique, smaller contexts. Historians were left with a multitude of contexts unconnected with each other. And by the late 1800s, transcendent entities were no longer tolerating what was now the historical science. In their absence, the unifying force came to be an immanent generalized life force, or the philosophy of vitalism that nevertheless preserved a degree of uniqueness since it fostered spontaneity. Mostly the idea of a universal energizing and hence pan-explanatory force was dropped altogether. This trend strengthened the relativist inclinations inherent in historicism. As a result, relativism became an acute issue. Since the mid-1800s, some historians have begun to look at the world in different ways. They used the term scientific in the manner of natural scientists as they championed various degrees of empiricism, the centrality of general and large-scale structures and forces, cause and effect chains, and laws of history. These historians delved into aspects of life not readily dealt with by historicist inquiries. Economic and social histories were favored in all their respects. Eventually, the state had to yield its prominence to civil society. The pre-war calls for a new history attuned to the social sciences still reverberated. Responses to them did reinforce the ideal of a history relying on methods that could grasp the phenomena beyond the individual and included generalizations, perhaps even laws. These new historians argued that history could, in that way, more readily encompass all aspects of life. Hope was strong that such a history, a new social history, could be more useful to modern life. Social strife and the Great Depression tended to enhance interest in the new perspective on history, but after 1918, opportunities to develop new ways to deal with history were too often few and the resistance to innovation too strong. The pioneering scholars worked for most of the years preceding 1939 in Strasbourg, not in Paris, the intellectual center of France. In Germany, the failure of Lamprecht's social and cultural history, as well as general suspicions of Marxist influence in both these types of history, reduced social history to a strongly ethnically accented Volksgeschichte, or nation history. Only in America did a version of social history, also known as American Progressive History, obtain a position of prestige. Its success was due to the powerful presence of the affirmation of progress in the American sense of history. The expectation of a steadily increasing rationality inspired confidence in the future. Economic history, subject to less prejudice, prospered modestly. Yet the period of prominence for social history attuned to the scientific spirit came only after the year 1960. Major and fateful exceptions to the mainstream development of historiography were the historiographies of two official radical ideologies that rejected much of the Western tradition and its views on history. For the first was communism, which tolerated only a pan-economic interpretation of history, while the second was fascism, which offered little more than a quasi-biological and voluntarist reductionism. It can be cogently argued that their simplistic views of history misguided many of their actions with catastrophic consequences.